Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for being here. I'm delighted to be here with Annabel and with Pervin. So, the story behind the book is as interesting as the story itself. So, Annabel came to me, she said, I have a book, I have a story to tell, and nobody tells her the way the book happened better than Annabel herself. So basically, Annabel met this wonderful lady called Georgina Brown, and Georgina Brown had moved from England to Bombay for a little while. And Georgina and Annabel became good friends, and Georgina said, I want to see India through your eyes. I want to experience India the way you've experienced it. And that was the beginning of many conversations, which finally resulted in the book as we see it today. So I'd love to ask Annabel, really, the book has to begin with what that India that Annabel came to was like. You know, it's an India that we all dream about, that we don't really know. So what was India like in the 60s?
Yes, in some ways it was very similar, in some ways it was very different. But in the 60s, I'm now 84. In the 60s, you didn't know if you lived in England. I was born and brought up in Birmingham, went to boarding school. All of that is in the book, my sort of background that I came from. And really, one knew very little about India. So coming to India was, I didn't hesitate for a minute because I was coming really for my future husband. And of course, I fell in love with India when I came. Should I read this?
So Annabel would like to start the afternoon reading about her first impression of India.
I thought it might help. I landed in Bombay on the 25th of March, and this was 1966. Standing at the top of the steps of the plane in a short blue Mary Quant style skirt, I felt a blast of humid Bombay hot air, hotter and wetter than I had ever experienced. The sky looked like boiled milk. I was used to grayness, gloom, and cold. I took my first breath of India. Petrol fumes, sewage, rotting garbage, all rather intense and mildly nauseating. But I quickly discovered like most things Indian, there is always a flip side to the bad. In this case, the heady scents of tuberoses, frangipani, and jasmine in the garden at Anand's house. Anand met me in a Chevy Bel Air, a ridiculously long turquoise and white car driven by Varma, one of the Mehta family's drivers. Rama's father had been the driver before him. I have always been a bit of an anorak about motor cars, so while everything else is a blur, I vividly remember noticing the cars on my first drive from the airport. Most were ambassadors, very like the British Morris Oxfords I had left behind, and the traffic moved reasonably fast along the main roads. In the garden of the bungalow on Warden Road in Breach Candy, the extended Mehta family had gathered to greet me, curious about the English girl Anand had invited to stay. Crypto, the family Labrador, lay twitching in the sun and didn't bother to introduce himself. Ever since Anand's return, his mother had been asking each morning, Baba, when are we going to meet Annie? Anand was 26 years old, and like so many eldest sons in India, had been nicknamed Baba from birth. Apparently, his youngest sister, Jill, used to tease him by stealing my letters to him from the breakfast table and refusing to hand them over until he gave her a rupee. The family quite literally opened their arms to me, calling me Annie from the start. Anand's mother dipped her finger into a pot of thick liquid and placed a red spot on my forehead. Her welcome was as warm as could be, and I had to pinch myself to realize that this was really happening to me. Already, faraway England seemed very chilly, and the English very literally buttoned up. So this was my first sort of impression of the warmth and the hospitality and it really, from the first moment I arrived, I think I just loved it, and I never regretted anything. I never looked back. And I describe in the book, you know, how I stayed with the family to see whether I could live here. Because I was 26, I was working as a social worker in London. I had family, I had friends. But when I took the decision to come here, opposed by my family, Anand's family just couldn't have been sweeter. And that was the start of what, to me, has been the most fascinating time in India.
So it was a life that went, you know, on many paths, and she went on to raise her family there. And so Annie also became the mother-in-law of one of the most famous people we know. Her daughter married Sachin Tendulkar, and you know she has wonderful stories about her life with her family and about Sachin. And she wanted to read a little bit about that. After which, we're going to talk about Pervin and the amazing work Annabel did in Bombay.
Actually,
You'll have to hold the mic close.
Angeli was always a serious girl, and she joined medical school in JJ Hospital, and had an occasional boyfriend here and there, nothing special. But all that changed when she saw Sachin with Aparna, who's here, at the airport. But she was very clever because she lived at home, and we had only one telephone, and Anand and me did not know about their relationship for 2 whole years, which was amazing. So the time came when that changed, and he came to a house, and then he went to England to play in Yorkshire. And he was living in a place called Dewsbury. And I'd met him for the first time a few days before he went, and I realized that something serious was going on, but we didn't know. I mean, neither my husband nor I had ever talked to him. So I was also going to London. He was in England. Angeli was my daughter, was going to be there. So I said, oh, goodness me, you know, I need to find out what's going on. So I'll quote from what is written. The moment I knew that Angeli was in Dewsbury with Sachin, I reckoned that this was a potentially serious situation, and I was going to have to deal with it. Luckily, I was flying to London myself 2 weeks later. As soon as I could get hold of her, I told Angeli that when I came over, I wanted to meet Sachin and talk to him alone. Angeli, Sachin and Mufi were waiting for me at my brother Richard's house in Bayswater. I asked them to leave me with Sachin. As we sat down on benches either side of the long kitchen table, I thought how young and sweet he looked, and I had to remind myself why we were there. I told him that Angeli was our very precious only child, doubly precious because we had lost our second daughter, and I asked him what his intentions were as far as Angeli was concerned. Traditionally in England, this would have been the father's remit. However, Anand is nothing like a traditional British male, which is one of the reasons why I married him. He loathes confrontations. Moreover, he could have won mastermind on the subject of the 19-year-old Master Blaster's career thus far, so he might not have been terribly objective about Sachin's suitability as his daughters intended. I had clocked by then that Sachin was the brightest star in the Indian cricketing firmament, but I was concerned by the possibility of him becoming a playboy like so many of his fellow cricketers. It comes with the territory. Sachin in India in the 90s was like David Beckham in England. I needed to look him in the eye and ask him how he felt about my daughter. "We want to get married," were his precise words, sweeping the rug from beneath my feet. I was astounded. I had always imagined Angeli marrying a tall, dark and handsome man. Dark and handsome Sachin was, but at 19 he was still a boy. He was so small, barely taller than Angeli, who was 5'5.5". Sachin's bouncy hair possibly gives him another inch, but not enough for Angeli to wear the high heels she had always loved. Angeli told me later that Sachin had made it clear from their very first date that he was serious. She was convinced she was his first girlfriend, and he was convinced that she was the one. They were truly, madly, deeply in love. I could see that. And all I wanted was for Angela to be happy. At a later stage, I would worry that he was away for long periods of time, which would test them in all sorts of ways. But all I could see at that moment was his young, innocent, hopeful, ecstatic face.
Oh, lovely. Oh, lovely. So before we move on to a conversation with Pervin, I really do want to talk to Annabel about, I want to hear from Annabel about this process of putting this book together, how she and Georgina started having these conversations. So I know it started 4 years ago, maybe?
Oh, longer.
Longer?
1918, 2018, I think it was, that I first met her. And she was a theatre critic in London. And she had come because her husband was the British Deputy High Commissioner in Bombay. He wasn't a diplomat, he was a businessman. And so after 20 years as a theatre critic, she was in Bombay with nothing to do except give boring parties for boring people and go to meetings that she hated. And so she'd been in Bombay a year, and she'd bought herself a second-hand car and used to drive to Dhobi Ghat and thing everywhere and try and find out. But she'd never found sort of people who she could really ask all the questions that were brewing inside her. So I was given her name as somebody who could write, and I thought I'd ask her to write about Apnale. And I went and had a cup of tea with her. But about 2 hours later, after a lot of chatting, I left, having more or less signed up for her to write about me, because what she was interested in was how I'd made the transition, really, from London in the swinging 60s to Bombay in the 60s, which was, of course, a very different city from what it is now in many respects, not in all. And so we started, I'd go over and we'd spend 2 or 3 hours just talking and recording it. She recorded it all on her iPhone. And we did it for more than a year of recording on the iPhone, and then came lockdown. We hadn't finished quite, but we'd covered a lot of ground, and suddenly she was back in the UK. And during lockdown, she started going through the recordings and producing this, because I can't write, a sentence coherently. And so I feel a bit of a fraud being with lots of writers.
It's your story.
But she wrote it, and eventually it turned into this book.
So bringing us to a conversation with Pervin. So Annie's life has been, every day, an elite life, meeting all kinds of interesting, exciting people. And also every single day of her life, she worked with the poorest of the poor when she worked with Apnale. And so I brought in my old friend Pervin, and I never knew, I had no idea that they'd actually work together. I know Pervin for a long time, and there is a dream to do a book with her. She knows that, I know that. But I called Pervin and I said, would you like to be here? Because I do think that not talking about Apnale is sort of doing a disservice to who Annabel is. So I wanted very much to have Pervin talk about Annie's work in Apnale and working with really disadvantaged people every single day of her life. This contrast almost every single day of her life. So over to you, Pervin.
So I just feel so happy to be here and to be meeting Annabel. I think we're meeting after maybe 15, 20 years. But I think, to get a sense of the kind of work and what Annabel has dedicated her life to, I think for me that this book is really about that, which is that Annabel and Apnale work in a particular area called the M ward in Bombay, and their indicators are worse than sub-Saharan Africa. So just to get a sense of the toughest possible terrain in urban poverty is the place that Apnale and Annabel went. And I think for me, and we had many interactions in my time in CRY as well, and I think I actually would very quickly forget that Annabel was from England and where she was from, except for the little accent, but there would also be now the Indian shake of the head as well, and the little Indian lilt. But more than that, it was her deep deep understanding that came from having just been immersed in that work, in that place, day in and day out. And I think in a time where, at a time where, we're so focused on identities and who we are and where we come from and being kind of, sometimes we can be almost dogmatic about it. I think Annabel is such an example of what it means when we say transcending identities, and transcending where we come from, what language we speak and how, because I think I've seen Annabel in Apnalaya, I've seen her at various meetings with various social workers, and Annabel was just, her connection was her empathy and her heart. And there was just a connection, and you'd see it, her people absolutely loved her. And it was not because she was founder or CEO or director. It was because she was just one of them, and that her heart and her understanding, she probably has a deeper understanding of urban poverty than I think a lot or most people in India do, actually. And I think the other thing that I remember about her as, a lot of times CRY was funding Apnalaya. And in the fundee relationship, the ones who are getting funding, will be sometimes a little deferential because there's funding at stake. Not so Annabel, at all. Ripon, who was the founder of CRY and a very dear friend of Annabel's as well, would, Annabel is on the phone, so you'd know, okay, he was getting a talking down to, a dressing down to, because we had sent them a check late. But actually what Annabel did for me, because once she called me and says, I want to talk to you. So I went there, little trepidation about what she was going to say. And she explained to me what the cost of 2 days delay in a check to the organization meant. And for me, that was it. It was that understanding, that heart for the people that are working. It was not just about, okay, we're doing this. And she was involved in every single detail. And so when you read this book and you hear Annabel's story, and I know there's so much of it is also about Sachin, but I think the more incredible story is not just that she made this passage to India, but she made the passage to an India that very, very few of us really encounter at all. And she did it. In fact, one of my colleagues was telling me when I was coming here, I spoke to Subhadra, who worked very closely with Annabel. And she said that Annabel was really ahead of her time, because in the 90s, when organizations were focused on programs, education, health, etc., Annabel was already talking about integrated community development, about empowering the community and enabling the community to take responsibility for the issues that they were dealing with. And this was way before the words empowerment, etc., became, now kind of fundamental to our work, So Annabel was really a pioneer in the work, and I think we were just so privileged to be part of their work. Yeah.
That's very, very sweet of you, Pervin, to say all that. Actually, in writing the book, it was the most difficult chapter to write, because my life has 2 or 3 different compartments, and the Apnale compartment is, for me, personally, it's been, a very major component of my life, spanning 50 years. I retired last year completely, and so for 50 years I did this work, and it meant so much to me. Sometimes it was to the neglect of other things, but it's so rewarding. I can't begin to say, we were talking just walking up here, how my brother, as a doctor, said he'd never been bored for a day in his life. I've never been bored for a day in my life. The people you meet, as Georgina wrote, from the Queen of England, to the multimillionaires, to the poorest of the poor. And the fascination, still now, I meet some of the people in our slums or some of our staff and things. It's the richness of India that, I know a tiny little portion of the 1.4 billion, but I know them across sectors. I don't just know the Sobo creamy layer, and that, I think, is why I'm most privileged in my life here. Then, of course, the sector, when Sachin came into our life, that brought a completely new element into my husband and I. That's something we shared as a family and with close friends. So, I've had all these extraordinary elements in a life here that I'd never have had if I'd married a you know, knobbly-kneed Englishman and lived in Essex. When I gave this book to my brother, and the one thing he objected to was my criticism of English men's knees. He said he'd never noticed my husband had lovely legs.
Oh, how sweet.
Annabel, just to ask you, like, you know, if you can tell us a bit about how you actually got into the work with Apnala. I think that
Yes.
would be really interesting for people to know.
Well, that goes much further back than my coming to India. When I was at school, I was a pianist. I was very good at the piano. And if you're very good at something in a boarding school, I was in a boarding school, you know, you tend to get everybody say, oh, you must take it up. So after I did O-levels, I concentrated on music and played the piano and was going to go to the Royal College of Music, which I did when I left school. But by the time I left school, I knew that I didn't want to do it as a career. And so I told my parents I didn't want to do music, because I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew I didn't want to, you know, teach little girls to play the piano for the rest of my life. And they persuaded me that I should, since I was very good. I was a gold medalist, you know. Everybody thought I was very good at the piano. I didn't, but everybody else did. And so finally my father said, you know, you go, if you don't like it, you can always drop out, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So I went and I did 2 years at the Royal College. It's normally a 3-year course. And then I started in London doing some volunteering in a youth club and going hop-picking groups for summer camps and things like that. And so I knew that I was moving towards working with people, really. And I saw an article in the paper saying that the London County Council was short of people to work in children's homes. So I went and applied for a job, and then I told my family, my parents, I was giving up music, and they, of course, were very angry. But, you know, to cut a long story short, I'd already gone into social work in the UK before I came here. I did 2 years at LSE, becoming a social worker. I worked with problem families in South London, the Elephant and Castle area, which was not a very good area. And so when I came to India, right from the start, I was looking for something to do. But I didn't know Hindi. In spite of efforts to learn, I'm dyslexic and very bad at languages. And I heard Hindi, Gujarati, Marathi, English, all day long. And so I did 1 or 2 other things when I first came here. I helped with a little organization that collected leftover food from weddings and distributed to the poor and institutions. And I did that till I was pregnant, and I had 2 babies. And then I started looking again seriously for something to do. And I was a founder member of the Spastic Society because I knew Mitu Chib and her husband, and did that for a while. And then I met Shanta Gupta, who was running Apnale really in the very early days. I was not the founder. Everybody says I'm the founder. It was founded by an Australian diplomat here. And he had just left India when I got to know Shanta and went there the first time. But it was already a registered organization. And so 3 of us, Shanta, Pushpa, and myself, really sort of built it up from the start. So that's how I got into it. And of course, it was wonderful. The first thing they asked me was to be the treasurer. Well, maths was my best subject at school. My father was a chartered accountant. I was not scared of money. So I had to learn double entry bookkeeping, and I used to do all the writing all the accounts, and paying the cash salaries, queuing in the Bank of India for hours on end. I mean, that's social work. And then, of course, the fundraising part, which I gather you hated too. So, so that's really how it started.
I think we have about 5 minutes. Any questions? I can see your hand up. I saw one earlier. Yes.
I feel like I know you because. Hi, Annabel. I feel like I know you because I wrote the oral history for Apnalaya. The oral history for Apnalaya, I was hired to write. So that part I really loved. What I want to know is how do you see the development sector has changed? Like, is there something that we would all laugh at now that you probably did at that time?
I don't think you'd laugh at anything that one did in social work. I mean, in the early years, one did much more of the sort of the welfare approach. So if children were, you know, underfed, you fed them. If they weren't going to school, you sponsored them to go to school. If there were no medical facilities, you tried to start a clinic and that sort of thing. The change that's happened over the years, a little bit what Pervin just touched on, the integrated approach. What we realized, because having started with just a sort of isolated shed at Nariman Point with slum dwellers roundabout, we moved into slum communities. And what we realized very early on, at Nariman Point, we realized you really can't help the child without helping the mother as well. The mother is controlled by the father, the husband, so you need to work with the father. The father is part of the bigger community, so you need to work with the community. So when we started working in slum communities, which at one stage we had 5 different centers in different slum communities, different parts of Bombay, some Hindu predominantly, some Muslim predominantly, was that, you know, everything is linked. If you work just on education and the child is undernourished and falling ill all the time, you don't really achieve that much. But if you try to look at the problems holistically, and I think that we were one of the first, as Pervin said, organizations to try and help people to help themselves to solve these sort of problems. Teaching, the obvious thing, you teach a mother, and you have to be careful how you teach it, and there's a lot of skill in evolving techniques to teach people how to help themselves, so that they don't think that it's just you coming in and telling them do this and don't do that, what you're doing is wrong, do this. So there's a lot goes into all this sort of thing, and then it's more than just feeding your child and sending the child to school. That was relatively easy, and that was happening on the bigger scene too within India. But then going further than that, until now, Apnale is working, I'm not involved, as I was before, in citizenship, working with young people, what are their rights and responsibilities, what they can do, how they can work with government. We work a lot with government, and we always have tried to work with government. We've never been against them. So there's sort of empowering, the word empowerment, as you say, it's bandied around a lot nowadays. We had a very dear friend at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and I used to learn the jargon from her, you know, people's participation and clients' right to self-determination. I'd always say, Pratima, what's the latest jargon? And the latest jargon at the moment is, you know, participation and empowerment and all these sort of things. So it's changed from really, the basic change has been from a more welfare approach to a much more participatory approach in helping people.